out in New York, there really hasn't been a better time to be a retired skilled worker, someone who's maybe worked in the subway or transit system, because the subway, as reported in the New York Times, is presenting people with a lot of money, a lot of incentive to come back to work. A couple numbers to throw your way. Retired subway workers are being offered $35,000 to come back for 3 months. That's on top of other bonuses that we're seeing, which include bus drivers in New Jersey who are receiving signing bonuses of $6,000. Light rail and bus drivers out in Houston, Texas are receiving $4,000. Hard to find mechanics are being offered up to $8,000. So there's a lot of money being thrown at the problem, which is the labor shortage that's been catalyzed by a shift in the way people view work as a function of the pandemic. Surprisingly, typically with recessions, we find that retirement decreases. So the last two recessions, the recession and the Great Recession, we saw retirement fall. And this typically is because people typically haven't saved enough money at the end of their careers and will come back to work in order to try and fund the lifestyle, right? As the market falls too. During times of recession, people can't lean as heavily into their 401k or their savings, and so they go back to work to try and fill the gaps in their budgets. The COVID-19 recession has been very different, and one of the issues, and we'll explore this in a separate recording, is that of the 5 reasons we've identified that we're having a labor shortage, one is that we've had this increase in number of individuals who've retired and retired early. We've had millions of individuals who have pulled their retirement forward. Maybe they would have retired in 4, 5, 6 years. They've pulled that to today because of the money that's been thrown into the economy at the beginning of the pandemic, probably bolstering up the stock market and then enabling them to live off their retirements early. And so what that means, of course, is that we have across the country a work infrastructure that's struggling. We see jobs that previously were lower paying, lower wage, and people just don't want to do those jobs anymore. The subway system is probably one of those that falls into that category, that stereotypical category of lower wage work, that now that people have a little bit more choice because there's so many more opportunities in the market, they're not choosing to do. But transit in any of the major metros, in any city anywhere, is pivotal. And cities like New York can't run without adequate staffing for their transit. And so this is what happens. This is one of the implications. Compensation goes up. And, it'll be interesting to, of course, see the long tail effects of this. What happens when these incentives get removed again, or the subway system or the city can't afford to pay out these above market or above average incentives for people to come back to work? Do they stay? You get that psychological thing that happens when you throw money at issues, is that people typically get used to those scenarios. For example, if you give somebody double their wages and in a couple months say, okay, we've got to bump you back down to where you were before, that's almost an impossible ask for most people. This might be the case when it comes to these incentives and these bonuses and sign-on bonuses that we're seeing in the transit system in New York, and then of course in Houston and different places across the country. So it's definitely a way that you can get people to come back to work in the short term, filling that gap of workers who retired and incentivizing them to come back to work, because they're easier for a company or an organization anyway, because they're a more attractive group of workers to bring back because there's less training involved, especially if they've done the job before. And so you can throw a little bit more money at that problem on kind of that top end of the spectrum. It's a little bit more difficult when you've actually got to do the outlay for training for maybe entry level or greener staff. So this is one of the implications I think that we've talked about a lot at Daggerfinn, how companies are going to get people to come back to work. This is, I think, a magnified version of that. But it shows that cities and organizations need labor in order to function. And especially things like transit and you've seen even the mishaps or what's happening with the airlines with cancellations, because they're short on labor too. It's difficult to do work or for these companies to run without adequate labor. And the problem, or the question that we need to ask ourselves as a labor force is, are we making the requisite investments now such that we don't see these problems 6, 12, 18 months down the road? And I always posit that comes back to what you do at an employer brand level, and how you're positioning your organization to candidates, to the talent pool, to make sure that you're attractive. But also, what are you doing when people are with you, the employees are with you, to make sure that your employee experience is sound and attractive for people to stay, and you keep your tenure high. So interesting developments out in New York and Houston, stuff to look forward to, or stuff to track as we continue through this work environment that's coming out of the pandemic.